In the summer of 1980, beneath the suffocating heat of Liberia's rain-soaked forests, a small village gathered for what they called the Night of the Masks. It was meant to be sacred, an ancient renewal repeated for centuries. But when the masks were lifted, witnesses swore they saw eyes that were not their own staring back, and the children born afterward were not entirely human. Welcome to Hidden Docks, where we peel back the rot beneath history's surface. If the forbidden calls to you, if silence unsettles you, subscribe and join us. Tonight we uncover a ritual from 1980 that birthed a generation cloaked in shadows and silence. In the dry season of 1980, as dust hung low over the red earth of Liberia's countryside, a village on the edge of Nimba County prepared for a night unlike any other. Their chief had called for the Night of the Masks, an ancestral ritual said to reach across time, binding the living to those who had gone before. The year was heavy with tension. Samuel Doe's coup d'etat was only weeks away, and rumors of soldiers moving through the forest already pressed on the villagers' minds. But inside this clearing, under an oil lamp glow, politics felt like another world. Here the people believed only in the masks. Each mask was carved from kola wood, smoothed with ash and palm oil, and painted with blood from sacrificed fowl. They were not decorations. Elders swore the faces were maps, openings through which the ancestors could enter and walk among the living. That night, men and women gathered in silence, their eyes hidden behind hollow sockets, their breaths slow and uneven. Witnesses recalled an unsettling quiet that spread across the forest just before the drums began. Crickets stopped their song. The usual chatter of night birds fell still. Even the wind, some said, seemed to vanish. The forest was listening, whispered an old villager years later, as if it knew something had arrived. When the drumming started, it was relentless, deep, slow, like a heartbeat shaking the earth. Masked dancers circled the fire, their steps deliberate, their chants low and guttural. For hours the dance continued, until one by one the masked elders pressed their faces toward the flames, as if feeding the fire with the spirits inside them. Then, in a moment no one could explain, the fire bent. The flames leaned sideways, stretching toward the dancers as though pulled by unseen hands. The villagers gasped, but no one moved. They believed leaving the circle would bring ruin on their families. And so they stood frozen, forced to watch. When dawn broke, the ritual ended as quickly as it began. The masks were placed in the sacred hut, locked away with herbs and charms. The forest noise returned, almost too loud, as if mocking the silence of the night before. But something had shifted. Within months, women of the village began to speak of strange dreams, visions of faceless children standing at their bedsides. By the following year, the first of those children were born, and the villagers would whisper for decades that none of them were truly theirs. On the morning of April 12, 1980, the streets of Monrovia shook with gunfire. At the executive mansion, Master Sergeant Samuel Doe, a 28-year-old from the Kran ethnic group, stormed the capital with a handful of enlisted men. Within hours, President William Tolbert, who had ruled Liberia since 1971, was dead in his own bed, stabbed and shot as soldiers dragged him from his chamber. The coup was swift, brutal, and merciless. Ministers loyal to Tolbert were rounded up, accused of corruption, and paraded through the city in chains. By April 22nd, 13 of them were tied to telephone poles at Barclay Training Center and executed by firing squad before a crowd of thousands. Blood stained the sand, and the images captured by foreign journalists would haunt the nation forever. But in the countryside, far from the stage spectacle, another story was whispered. The villagers who had gathered for the Night of the Masks only weeks before looked back at the ritual with unease. They remembered the silence that descended on the forest, the fire bending against the wind. And now, with the nation in flames, they called it an omen. The ancestors had warned us, one elder said years later. The masks danced for blood. The timing was too sharp to ignore. In their worldview, rituals and politics were not separate threads. They were bound in one fabric. To them, Tolbert's fall was not the work of young soldiers, but of spirits angered by a president who had turned too far toward the West, who had forgotten the old ways. The coup, they said, was written in the fire that night. And yet, amid the terror of executions and soldiers in the streets, women in that same village found themselves carrying children conceived after the masked festival. Their pregnancies were marked by unease, strange cravings, fevers without cause, sudden visions that left them trembling. Some claimed their unborn children whispered in the night, voices muffled but urgent, as if speaking through walls. When word of these pregnancies spread, the elders connected them directly to the coup. They said the chaos of April 12th had opened the way for something else to slip into the world. Our generation touched not by ancestors, but by shadows. Across Liberia, the executions were remembered as the moment the country fractured. But in that village, the true fracture had already begun. For them, the deaths in Monrovia were only the echo of what had been summoned in the forest, and as soldiers celebrated their new power, the villagers braced themselves, not for politics, but for the children who would soon arrive. By late 1980, the first of the children conceived after the Night of the Masks were born. To many, they seemed ordinary infants, fragile, quiet, easily swaddled, but within months whispers spread through the village. Mothers reported that their babies were different. Some spoke their first words before they could even walk, forming sentences with eerie clarity at 6 or 7 months old. One mother swore her son addressed her by her full name, the way only an elder might. Others claimed their infant stared into mirrors for hours, unblinking, as if studying their own faces with a depth of recognition no child should possess. And then there was the aversion to light. Several children cried uncontrollably when carried into the sun, their skin breaking into rashes within minutes. Families began to shield them indoors, feeding them in the cool of shadowed huts. By dusk, however, the children grew alert, restless even. Neighbors recalled hearing their laughter ripple through the village at night, laughter that sounded too old, too knowing. The villagers began to call them the Heirs. To them, these children were not cursed but chosen, bloodlines marked by whatever had entered the masks that night. Elders insisted they must be protected, for they carried something beyond human breath. But the rumors did not stop at the village. Word traveled to Monrovia, where Liberia's fragile new government was desperate to stamp out stories that could unsettle an already unstable nation. Western doctors, brought in through missionary channels, were dispatched to investigate. What they found disturbed even them. Reports described infants with abnormally rapid cognitive development, uncanny verbal skills, and resistance to medical examination. One physician noted that a child refused to be weighed, screaming until the scale itself tipped over. Another wrote that a girl barely 8 months old mimicked his voice perfectly, tone for tone, accent for accent, before falling silent, smiling at him in a way he could not explain. These findings, however, rarely made it past the first draft. Most of the files vanished as the First Liberian Civil War approached. Hospitals burned, clinics were looted, and records disappeared into the chaos. But fragments remain. Photocopied notes tucked into old missionary journals, letters sent back to Europe by shaken aid workers. They describe not illness, not possession, but something emergent. By 1982, a pattern had become undeniable. Every child conceived after the ritual bore some mark of difference. Their bodies were fragile, but their eyes seemed older. Some villagers whispered that when the children cried at night, the sound was not of infants but of ancestors, calling through thin walls. To outsiders, it was superstition. To the villagers, it was truth. The heirs were no longer just children. They were signs, and in the silence of their growth, the village began to fear what they might become. By 1982, the whispers from the hinterlands reached Monrovia's narrow streets and university halls. The stories were impossible to ignore. Children who spoke like elders, who recoiled from sunlight, who laughed in voices that didn't sound like their own. At first, the government dismissed them as rumor. But within the University of Liberia's medical faculty, a small group of physicians decided to look closer. They arranged for several of the children, boys and girls barely 2 years old, to be quietly brought into the city. Officially, the visits were medical checkups sponsored by missionary charities. Unofficially, they were controlled examinations conducted in the basement labs of the university hospital. The first thing doctors noted was resilience. Blood drawn from one child clotted unnaturally fast. Another endured injections without flinching, as if pain was foreign to him. A physician scribbled in his notes, resistance beyond typical pediatric parameters. The body rejects intrusion, but what unsettled them most wasn't physical. It was collective. During one exam, 4 children placed together in a small ward began to hum in unison. Low at first, then louder, the tone vibrating the glass panes. A nurse reported feeling dizzy, as if the sound pressed against her skull. Several staff fainted. Later, the incident was dismissed as a group hallucination. The children, however, seemed entirely calm, watching, waiting. One file described an encounter that researchers refused to speak about again. A little girl, no more than 18 months old, fixed her eyes on the lead physician and repeated back every word he had spoken since entering the room, in the exact order, like a recording. But when pressed, she added words he hadn't said, phrases from his private conversations the night before. He fled the room pale, shaking. The medical team began documenting obsessively. Handwritten notes, photographs, audio reels. A paper was drafted, tentatively titled Evidence of Abnormal Developmental Cohorts in Rural Liberia. But before it could be presented, the country shifted. Samuel Doe's regime, now tightening its grip, ordered raids on campuses suspected of harboring dissent. Soldiers stormed the University of Liberia. When they left, the medical wing's records were gone. Cabinets were overturned, film reels smashed, and the basement labs sealed. Students whispered that it wasn't politics that drew the soldiers there, it was the children. Several of the researchers fled the country. A handful escaped to Europe, carrying with them scraps of data, photocopies, fragments of testimony. Years later, in obscure conferences, some hinted at their findings. One biologist in Switzerland claimed, "It was not pathology. It was not mutation. What we observed was beyond genetics." Others never spoke of it again, their silence more haunting than their words. What began in a village ritual had now become something larger, a mystery at the intersection of culture, war, and science. But to the people who lived beside the Heirs, it wasn't theory. It was survival, and the children were only just beginning to grow. By the mid-1980s, the whispers had crossed borders. Liberia was unraveling under Samuel Doe's tightening rule, but just across the Mano River, in Sierra Leone, the Kissi tribes kept their own ancient rites alive. It was here, among forested hills and stone-marked graves, that the masks reappeared. The Kissi had always been known for their deep traditions. Anthropologists who visited the region in the 1960s recorded masked dances that invoked ancestral protection, spirits of fertility, and vengeance. But after the chaos of Liberia, villagers began noticing a ritual that didn't belong to memory. It was something new, yet eerily familiar. They called it the Second Night of the Masks. Accounts are fragmented, pieced together from missionaries, local elders, and scattered anthropological notes. On a moonless night in 1984, the Kissi gathered deep in the bush. Men wore carved wooden faces painted in ash and blood, their eyes hollow, their movements jerking like broken marionettes. Women followed in silence, carrying gourds filled with liquid that smelled of iron. Witnesses remembered the forest itself going still. No crickets, no owls, only the steady beat of drums that felt older than language. Then, at the center of the clearing, children barely old enough to walk were brought forward. Elders later confessed that it wasn't a blessing for prosperity. It was an offering. Months later, reports emerged of Kissi infants born with pale, almost translucent eyes. Mothers swore the children woke at night, humming a chant in unison that no one had taught them. One father told a visiting researcher that his son's first words were not in Kissi or Mende, but in a tongue older than the land. The parallels to Liberia were undeniable. Villages whispered that these were not heirs of chiefs or tribes at all. They belonged to the masks. The spirits came down and claimed wombs, one elder said. These children are not ours. They are theirs. Western visitors tried to dismiss it as coincidence. Malnutrition, disease, stress. Rational explanations for pale eyes, stunted growth, or strange behavior. But skeptics could not explain the chance. Entire groups of toddlers were heard singing the same sequence of tones in different villages, days apart, with no way to have learned it from one another. A priest in Freetown wrote in his diary in 1985, "I traveled to the eastern province to hear the so-called masked children. At midnight, I stood outside a hut and listened. The voices were not childish. They were collective, one voice made of many mouths. I did not enter. I could not. As the decade edged toward war, the pattern became undeniable. First Liberia, now Sierra Leone, the masked rituals were spreading like echoes, each leaving behind children who were never quite human. And as the masks moved, so too did the shadows. By the late 1980s, Liberia was breaking apart. The coup that had once promised renewal had dissolved into corruption, brutality, and resentment. In 1989, Charles Taylor launched his invasion, and the country descended into one of the bloodiest civil wars of the modern era. It was in this crucible of violence that the heirs of the masks reached adolescence. Villagers had whispered about them since 1980, children with pale eyes, strange voices, and an unsettling presence. Now as teenagers, they became part of Liberia's most infamous legacy, the child soldiers. Survivors recall the way commanders recruited them. Some were forced at gunpoint, others offered food, but there were accounts of boys and girls who walked into the rebel camps willingly, as if summoned. Witnesses said they stood at the edge of clearing fires, silent, until a commander beckoned them forward. Then they fought with a ferocity that unsettled even hardened killers. Former fighters interviewed years later described them with awe and dread. So you could shoot them, and they would keep coming, one man told a human rights researcher in Monrovia in 1997. They were not afraid of bullets. They looked at you with empty eyes, and you felt something inside you collapse. In Monrovia's 1990 massacres, where entire neighborhoods were swept away in blood, eyewitnesses claimed to have seen children leading assaults, barefoot, unflinching, their bodies painted in ash. In Gbanga, the NPFL stronghold, survivors said the mask heirs danced before raids, chanting the same tones first heard in the villages. Commanders believed they were possessed, touched by spirits that made them unstoppable. It was not just myth whispered by villagers anymore. Liberian Red Cross workers, missionaries, and foreign journalists all recorded accounts of teenagers who seemed untouchable. Some said their wounds closed overnight. Others swore they could walk through crossfire unharmed. Rational voices dismissed it as wartime exaggeration, fear magnified by chaos. But too many testimonies pointed to the same image. The children born after the masks had grown into shadows of war. One UN worker recalled seeing a boy no older than 14 leading a group of fighters into Kakata. His face was streaked with white clay, his eyes unnaturally pale. The worker swore that when the boy turned for a split second, the mask wasn't painted. It was real, wooden, ancient, staring back. Liberia's war consumed a generation, but hidden in its brutality was a darker thread, one that soldiers spoke of only in whispers. Not every fighter was born of violence. Some, they said, were born of the masks, and when the war ended, not all of them died. When the war consumed Liberia in the early 1990s, it was not only bodies that vanished into the earth, but paper. Government ministries, university libraries, and hospital archives burned as rebels sacked Monrovia. By 1992, entire wings of national records no longer existed. What should have been a generation's worth of medical data, census files, and church registries had been reduced to ash. Yet in the shadows of this destruction, fragments survived. UN investigators arriving in the mid-1990s stumbled upon boxes of charred documents inside the ruins of the Ministry of Health. Among them were half-burned reports dating to 1982, clinical notes written in uneven typewriter ink. One page described children resistant to malaria and other endemic illnesses. Another spoke of cognitive dissociation, where children spoke in voices their parents did not recognize. The language was clinical, but the implications were not. Some investigators quietly copied the pages, sending them back to Geneva. There, the documents were stamped classified. To the public, they did not exist. Meanwhile, the families who had once paraded their heirs as chosen ones began to retreat into silence. In the 1980s, parents had carried these children proudly through the village square. By the mid-1990s, the same parents avoided speaking their names. Rumors spread that their blood carried the night things, spirits that entered during the ritual and never left. Missionaries working in Bong County wrote of families refusing medical care when their children fell ill. Doctors cannot treat what is not of this world, one father allegedly told them. In some villages, children were hidden in huts, never allowed near outsiders. The people who had once called them gifts now feared them as living curses. Even outsiders who searched for answers found themselves lost. In 1996, a French journalist claimed to have interviewed 3 survivors, young men in their late teens with pale eyes and unsettling composure. Weeks later, her notes disappeared from her hotel room in Abidjan. She told colleagues someone had followed her, whispering through the door at night, in a language she could not recognize. By the time the Second Liberian Civil War erupted in 1999, any hope of assembling a coherent record was gone. Archives had been erased by fire, testimonies buried by fear, and survivors scattered across refugee camps in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Ivory Coast. And yet, the whispers remained. Among aid workers, missionaries, even UN officials, the phrase persisted: the heirs of the masks. Not documented, not proven, but alive, somewhere in the shadows of West Africa. The official history of Liberia records nothing about them, but unofficially, in the places where war and ritual intertwine, the memory lingers like smoke that refuses to clear. When the wars finally ended, silence was not peace. It was survival. Refugees carried their scars across borders, and with them, memories too heavy to be told aloud. But in scattered camps from Guinea to the Ivory Coast, fragments of testimony began to surface. They spoke not of ordinary war crimes, but of something stranger, something older. A woman named Mariatu recalled her younger brother. He was only 13 when the fighting consumed their village. She said he returned from the bush, but his voice was not his own. At night, when the family huddled around a single kerosene lamp, he would speak in tones deep and hollow, as if another being used his throat. The elders whispered he had been claimed by the mask spirits, a vessel walking in a boy's body. Another survivor, Fatu, told investigators of nights when she saw children gather behind the refugee tents. No masks were visible, yet the children swayed as though hidden faces covered their own. They hummed chants too ancient for her to recognize, their rhythm echoing the drums of lost ceremonies. She swore the air grew cold when they moved in unison, as if the night itself bowed to them. Not every voice condemned these airs. Some described them as victims, children forced to carry the weight of ancient rituals while caught in a modern war. Yet even the most sympathetic accounts carried fear. One man admitted he could not look his own cousin in the eyes after seeing the boy lick blood from his hands as though it were water. UN researchers documented these stories but struggled to reconcile them. Were they fragments of folklore twisted by trauma, or evidence of something beyond human understanding? One investigator wrote in the margin of a classified file, "They are neither ghosts nor soldiers. They are vessels, and the vessel does not choose what fills it." As the refugees moved farther from home, the stories traveled with them. Camps in Conakry and Abidjan buzzed with whispered warnings. Do not let the children walk alone at night. Do not follow if you hear chanting, and never look into the pale eyes of a child who does not blink. These oral accounts became a shadow archive, passed not through paper, but through trembling voices. To this day, survivors disagree on what the heirs truly were. Some believe they carried curses, others blessings twisted into horror. But all agree on one point. Once you had seen a child wearing an invisible mask, you were never the same again. By 1997, the fires of Liberia's civil war had shifted, and a fragile order was forced into place under Charles Taylor's rise. Yet beneath the surface of political triumph, whispers of one final ritual spread across the borderlands of Nimba County. It was said the heirs, the children born in shadows marked by pale eyes and invisible masks, were called together for a last gathering. Villagers remembered the night with unease. The air was thick, humid, and still, as if the forest itself held its breath. From the hills, witnesses claimed to see faint processions, small figures moving in silence, guided not by drums but by an unseen rhythm. No songs, no words, only the crunch of leaves under bare feet. They walked toward the deep bush, toward a clearing long forbidden. An old farmer described fires glowing in the distance. They burned brighter than torches, but no smoke touched the sky. He swore that when he returned the next morning, no embers remained, only soil darkened as though light itself had been scorched into the ground. Some said the ritual was not for war, nor for vengeance, but for release. that the heirs had been vessels too long, their childhoods consumed by spirits older than the nation itself. The elders, broken by war and secrecy, allowed the children to walk into the forest so the masked spirits might reclaim them. It was less a ceremony and more a surrender. Others tell a darker story, that the ritual was forced, a desperate attempt to bury what had grown uncontrollable. They claim some heirs resisted, their voices echoing in tones not their own, begging to remain, and that when the flames rose, the forest itself shuddered as though swallowing them whole. No bodies were ever recovered. No graves marked their disappearance. Families who once paraded the heirs in public fell into silence, refusing to answer questions, some even abandoning villages altogether. For investigators who arrived later, there was nothing left to study. No artifacts, no documents, only fragments of testimony and soil that seemed colder than the rest of the earth. The last masking closed the chapter on a generation born between war and ritual, between myth and survival. Their existence cannot be proven in full, yet their absence weighs heavier than evidence. Survivors say that on certain nights in Nimba, when the wind moves strangely through the trees, you can still hear the faint hum of children chanting. The heirs entered the forest and never returned. What was taken, what was released, remains unknown. All that is certain is that a story that began in shadows ended the same way, whispered, incomplete, and forever unresolved. Some say the heirs still walk among us, grown now, hiding in plain sight. Others insist they were never human to begin with. The truth remains buried in burned archives and forgotten testimonies. If you're ready for more forbidden history, join us next time as we uncover a convent where 12 nuns died, yet no body ever decayed.